7 years ago, I had a massive stroke. My wife and 2 adult sons visited me once in the hospital for 20 minutes and never came back. They abandoned me completely. My wife divorced me while I was helpless. My sons never visited once in 7 years, not for birthdays, not for holidays. They thought I would die. They thought they would inherit whatever is left of me. But what happened next shocked everyone. Before that, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And please subscribe to this channel so that my stories can reach more people. 7 years ago, when I was 68 years old, I'd been working in my home office on a Tuesday afternoon, had been reviewing some investment portfolios and making notes about commodity positions I was tracking, had been doing the kind of quiet financial work I'd done for decades as a successful commodities trader. I'd been feeling fine that morning, had eaten a normal breakfast with my wife Margaret, had kissed her goodbye when she'd left to meet friends for lunch, had settled into my office around 10, expecting to work until dinner time like I usually did. Around 2 in the afternoon, I'd started feeling strange, had noticed my left hand wasn't responding properly when I'd tried to write something down, had felt a weird numbness spreading up my left arm that had made me pause and wonder if I'd slept on it wrong somehow. I'd stood up from my desk to shake out my arm, and that's when everything had gone catastrophically wrong. My left leg had buckled under me, my vision had gone blurry, and I'd felt the most intense headache of my life exploding behind my eyes, like something was rupturing inside my skull. I'd collapsed right there in my office, had fallen across my desk, scattering papers and knocking over my coffee mug, had tried to call out for help but my mouth wouldn't form words properly, had felt terror as I'd realized something was seriously wrong with my brain. I'd managed to knock my phone off the desk as I'd fallen and had tried to reach for it, but my left side wasn't working at all, was completely dead and unresponsive. And I'd lain there on the floor unable to move or speak or do anything except feel my consciousness fading as the stroke had destroyed parts of my brain. My neighbor Mrs. Chen had found me hours later. She'd noticed that my office lights had been on all night, which was unusual since I normally shut everything down before bed, and she'd gotten worried enough to come over and ring the doorbell. When I hadn't answered, she'd used the spare key I'd given her years ago for emergencies, had come inside calling my name, had found me unconscious on my office floor in a pool of spilled coffee with papers scattered everywhere. She'd called 911 immediately, and paramedics had arrived within minutes, had loaded me onto a stretcher, and had rushed me to the hospital with sirens blaring. I'd been unconscious for 3 weeks, had been in a coma while doctors had worked to reduce the swelling in my brain and assess the damage from the massive stroke, had been hooked up to machines that breathed for me and monitored my vital signs and kept me alive while my brain tried to heal. The stroke had been severe, had affected the right side of my brain, which controlled the left side of my body, had destroyed enough tissue that doctors had told my family I might never wake up, and if I did wake up, I'd likely have permanent paralysis and speech problems and cognitive deficits that would require long-term care. When I'd finally regained consciousness after 3 weeks, I'd been confused and disoriented, hadn't known where I was or what had happened, had tried to move, and had discovered that my entire left side was paralyzed and unresponsive. I'd tried to speak, and the words had come out slurred and wrong, had sounded like nonsense even to my own ears, had made me panic as I'd realized I couldn't communicate properly or control my own body. Nurses had rushed to my bedside when they'd seen I was awake, had tried to calm me down and explain that I'd had a stroke, that I'd been unconscious for weeks, that I was in a long-term care facility now because I'd need months of rehabilitation. The doctors had come to examine me once I was stable, had done tests to assess the damage and determine my prognosis, had told me with professional sympathy that I'd suffered a massive ischemic stroke that had caused significant brain damage. They'd explained that I had paralysis on my left side that might improve with intensive physical therapy, but would likely never fully resolve, that my speech was impaired and would require speech therapy to regain, that I'd need to relearn basic tasks like walking and feeding myself and using the bathroom, that recovery would be slow and difficult, and there were no guarantees about how much function I'd ultimately regain. I'd asked about my family through slurred speech that was barely intelligible, had wanted to know where Margaret was and if my sons David and Robert knew what had happened to me. The nurses had told me my family had been notified, that they'd visited briefly when I'd first been admitted, that they knew I'd woken up and were expected to visit soon. I'd felt relief hearing that even though I'd been terrified about my condition, had thought that at least I had my wife and sons to support me through this nightmare, had believed that family would get me through the hardest challenge of my life. Margaret and my 2 sons had shown up the next day, had come into my room at the rehabilitation facility where I'd been moved after leaving the ICU, and I'd felt such hope seeing them walk through that door. But something had been wrong immediately. I'd seen it in their faces, in the way they'd looked at me lying there paralyzed and struggling to speak, in the expressions of discomfort, and something that looked almost like disgust as they'd taken in my condition. They'd stayed for maybe 20 minutes, had stood awkwardly near the door rather than coming close to my bed, had made stilted conversation about how shocking this all was, and how they hoped I'd recover soon. Margaret had done most of the talking while David and Robert had just stood there looking uncomfortable. She'd told me not to worry about anything at home, that she was handling everything, that I should focus on getting better. She'd said they'd come back soon to visit, had promised they'd be there to support me through my recovery, had kissed me briefly on the forehead before ushering our sons out of the room. I'd watched them leave, feeling uneasy about something I couldn't quite name, something in their body language and their hurry to get away that had felt wrong. But I'd told myself I was being paranoid, that they were just shocked and scared and needed time to process what had happened to me. I'd waited for them to come back like they'd promised, had asked nurses every day if my family had called or visited, had spent weeks expecting to see them walk through my door. But they never came back, not the next day or the next week or the next month, and slowly, I'd begun to understand that their 20-minute visit had been goodbye. That they'd looked at my paralyzed body and my slurred speech and my uncertain future and had decided I wasn't worth their time anymore. They never came back after that first 20-minute visit. Not for my 69th birthday, which came 2 months after my stroke. Not for Christmas that first year when I'd been in the facility for 4 months, learning to move my left arm in tiny, painful increments. Not for any of the 2,555 days I spent in that rehabilitation facility fighting to recover function that might never fully return. I'd waited the first few weeks thinking they were just busy or scared or needed time to adjust to my condition, had made excuses for them in my mind when they didn't show up, had convinced myself they'd come eventually once the shock wore off. But weeks turned into months, and months turned into years, and they never appeared, never called the facility to check on my progress, never sent cards or letters or flowers, never acknowledged in any way that I existed, or that they'd once been my family. The nurses had asked me constantly during those first months if my family was visiting today, had seen my name on their schedule, and had assumed, like everyone assumed, that a married man with adult children would have regular visitors, had been surprised each time when I'd told them no, nobody was coming today. After the first year, I'd stopped answering when nurses asked about visitors, had just shaken my head or changed the subject because talking about my family's absence made the abandonment feel more real and more painful. The visitor log at the facility's front desk never had any names in it except the staff who worked there, never showed Margaret or David or Robert signing in to see me, was just blank space next to my name, while other patients had logs filled with family members and friends who came regularly to support their recovery. I'd been in that facility learning to walk again when other patients had their families cheering them on, had been doing speech therapy exercises while other patients had spouses sitting with them encouraging every word, had celebrated tiny victories like being able to feed myself or use the bathroom independently with only nurses to witness because my family couldn't be bothered to show up. Every holiday had been torture, watching other patients have family gatherings in the common areas, while I'd sat alone in my room, seeing children and grandchildren visit their elderly relatives while my own children stayed away like I was already dead. 14 months after my stroke, Margaret had filed for divorce through her lawyers. I'd been served papers while lying in my hospital bed, barely able to hold a pen to sign documents, had read through legal language that cited my incapacity and changed circumstances as grounds for ending our marriage. She'd argued that my stroke had fundamentally changed our relationship, that I could no longer fulfill my role as a husband, that she couldn't be expected to remain married to someone who was permanently disabled and would require ongoing care, that our marriage was effectively over the moment I'd collapsed in my office. The divorce papers had come with no warning, no conversation, no chance for me to argue or fight back or even understand what was happening, just legal documents demanding my signature to end 32 years of marriage. Margaret's lawyers had made it clear she wanted a quick settlement, wanted to divide assets and move on with her life, wanted to be free of the burden of having a disabled husband who'd become an embarrassment and an inconvenience. I'd signed the papers because what choice did I have? I was trapped in a hospital bed, unable to work or earn money or hire lawyers to fight, was completely powerless to stop her from erasing me from her life. She'd gotten the house we'd lived in for 20 years, had gotten half of the bank accounts and investments she knew about, had walked away with roughly $800,000 in assets, and her freedom from a marriage to a man whose body had betrayed him. The divorce had been finalized quickly because I hadn't contested anything, hadn't had the energy or resources to fight, had just let her take what she wanted because I'd been focused on trying to relearn how to walk and speak and function as a human being. My sons David and Robert had never contested the divorce, had never called me to explain what was happening or ask if I was okay with it, had never visited to tell me they disagreed with their mother's decision or wanted to maintain a relationship with me separate from her. They'd just let Margaret erase me from their lives, had gone along with her narrative that I was too damaged to be worth keeping, had apparently decided that a father who'd had a stroke was no longer someone they needed to acknowledge or care about. I'd tried calling them in those early months when my speech had been terrible but functional enough to use a phone, had dialed David's number and Robert's number from the facility phone and had left voicemails that were probably mostly unintelligible, asking them to please visit, asking why they'd stopped coming, begging them to at least call me back so I'd know they still cared. But my calls had gone unreturned, my voicemails had been ignored, and eventually, I'd stopped trying because the rejection hurt worse than the physical pain of rehabilitation. The facility staff had watched all of this happen, had seen me go from hopeful to confused to heartbroken to resigned over the course of 7 years, had witnessed a family's complete abandonment of a man who'd done nothing wrong except have a stroke. They'd known I'd been married, had known I had sons, had seen the divorce papers I'd signed, and had understood that my family had decided I wasn't worth staying for, and their kindness to me had increased as they'd recognized I had no one else. The staff at Riverside Care Facility became the only family I had over those 7 years, became the people who showed up every single day, regardless of whether I was having good days or bad days, regardless of whether I was making progress or having setbacks, regardless of whether I was pleasant to be around or angry and frustrated with my limitations. The nurses worked rotating shifts, but there were a core group who'd been there since I'd arrived, women and men who'd seen me at my absolute worst when I'd first woken up unable to move half my body or speak clearly, who'd helped me with the most basic and humiliating tasks that come with being severely disabled. Nurse Maria had been assigned to me during my first months at the facility. She was a woman in her 40s from the Philippines who'd been working in elder care for 20 years and had seen countless stroke patients come through rehabilitation. She'd been the one to help me relearn how to feed myself when my left hand wouldn't cooperate, had sat with me for hours holding a spoon and guiding my right hand through the motions until muscle memory started returning, had cleaned up after me when I'd made messes, and had never once made me feel ashamed or embarrassed about needing help with things children could do. She'd been there for my small victories that my family never witnessed, had been the one clapping and celebrating the first time I'd managed to move my left fingers even slightly, had called other nurses over to watch when I'd taken my first shuffling steps with a walker after 6 months of intensive physical therapy. Maria had cried actual tears of joy when I'd finally been able to speak a complete sentence without slurring after 8 months of speech therapy, had hugged me and told me she was proud of me, had given me the validation and support that should have come from Margaret or my sons, but came only from her. The physical therapists had pushed me through pain that was sometimes unbearable, had made me do exercises that felt impossible when my body wouldn't cooperate, had refused to let me give up even when I'd wanted to quit, because the progress was so slow and the effort was so enormous. They'd worked with me 5 days a week for years, had celebrated every tiny improvement, had adjusted their approach when something wasn't working, had treated my recovery as their personal mission, even though I was just one of dozens of patients they saw. There was a physical therapist named James who'd worked with me for 3 years straight. He'd been the one to teach me to walk again after the stroke had taken that ability away. had started with me lying in bed, barely able to shift my weight, and had progressed over years to me walking independently with a cane. James had been patient when I'd been frustrated, had been firm when I'd wanted to give up, had believed in my recovery even when I'd stopped believing in it myself, and he'd never once made me feel like I was a burden, or too much work, or not worth his time. The social workers at the facility had sat with me on holidays when other patients had family visiting, and I'd been alone, had made sure I wasn't completely isolated on Christmas or Thanksgiving or my birthday, had brought me small gifts and cards to make the days feel less empty. They'd known about my family's abandonment, had seen the divorce papers, had understood that I had sons who'd chosen not to visit, and they'd tried to fill that void in whatever small ways they could. A social worker named Patricia had been particularly kind. She'd checked on me regularly even when it wasn't part of her official duties, had asked about my progress and my mood and whether I needed anything, had connected me with support groups for stroke survivors, and had helped me process the grief of losing not just my physical abilities, but also my entire family. She told me more than once that I deserved better than what my family had given me, that their abandonment was their failure, not mine, that being a stroke survivor didn't make me less valuable as a person. These people had witnessed 7 years of my family's complete absence, had seen patient after patient have regular visitors while my name never appeared on anyone's visitor list, had watched me spend holidays alone year after year, had understood that the people who should have loved me most had decided I wasn't worth their time. The staff had talked about it among themselves. I'd overheard conversations where they'd expressed anger at my family for abandoning me, where they'd said I was one of the kindest and most determined patients they'd worked with, and I didn't deserve to be treated this way. Maria had told me directly after about 2 years that the people who show up are your real family, that blood relation doesn't mean anything if those people don't actually care about you or support you when you need them. That the staff at Riverside had become my real family because they were the ones who'd been there through everything. She'd said I deserved better than Margaret and my sons had given me, that their abandonment said everything about them and nothing about me, that I should stop waiting for them to come back and should accept that the people who'd actually loved me were right here in this facility. Over 7 years, these nurses and therapists and social workers had celebrated my victories and had mourned my setbacks, had supported me through the darkest moments of depression when I'd wanted to give up, had pushed me to keep fighting when recovery seemed impossible, had treated me with dignity and respect and genuine affection that my blood family had never shown. They'd become the people I looked forward to seeing each day, the people whose opinions mattered to me, the people who made me feel valued and cared for, even when my wife and sons had made me feel disposable. What my wife Margaret and my sons David and Robert had never known, had never bothered to ask about or investigate during our divorce or at any point during our marriage, was that before my stroke, I'd been an extremely successful commodities trader who'd made a fortune in the 1980s and 1990s through smart investing and aggressive trading strategies that had paid off spectacularly. I'd started trading commodities in my late 20s, had learned the markets, and had developed an instinct for timing that had allowed me to make money consistently when other traders were losing their shirts, had built wealth slowly and steadily over decades, while living a lifestyle that gave no indication of how much I was actually worth. I'd always kept my business finances completely separate from my personal finances, had maintained different bank accounts and investment portfolios that Margaret had no access to or knowledge of, had never discussed the details of my trading success with her because she'd never been interested in my work, and I'd seen no reason to share information she didn't care about. She'd known I worked as a commodities trader, had known I made a comfortable living, but she'd never asked about the specifics of my income or my investments, or how much wealth I'd accumulated over the years. Margaret had been content with our lifestyle, which had been comfortable but not extravagant. We'd lived in a nice house in a good neighborhood but not a mansion, had taken vacations but not luxury trips, had driven decent cars but not expensive ones, had lived well within our means even though our actual means were far greater than she'd ever suspected. I'd chosen to live modestly because I'd never felt the need to show off wealth, had been raised to believe that flaunting money was tacky, had preferred to invest and save rather than spend on things that didn't matter to me. By the time I'd had my stroke at age 68, I'd accumulated approximately $12 million in various accounts, trusts, and holdings that were entirely separate from the joint accounts and assets Margaret knew about. I'd had investment portfolios with multiple brokerage firms, had owned some commercial real estate that generated rental income, had holdings in various commodities and futures that continued to appreciate, had structured everything carefully to minimize taxes and maximize growth over the long term. Margaret had gotten the house in our divorce settlement, a property worth maybe $400,000 that we'd paid off years earlier, and she'd gotten half of the joint bank accounts and retirement accounts she'd known about, which had totaled maybe another $400,000. She'd walked away from our marriage with roughly $800,000, thinking she'd gotten a fair split of everything I had, thinking she'd taken half of a reasonably successful trader's assets, having no idea that the accounts she'd known about represented only a tiny fraction of my actual wealth. The divorce lawyers had asked me to provide full financial disclosure, had requested statements from all my accounts and documentation of all my assets, and I'd provided exactly what they'd asked for, which was information about the joint accounts and the house and the retirement accounts that were in both our names. Nobody had asked about accounts that were solely in my name. Nobody had questioned whether there might be additional assets beyond what I'd disclosed. Nobody had done the kind of deep investigation that would have revealed the $12 million sitting in accounts Margaret had never known existed. I could have disclosed everything, could have told the divorce lawyers about the full extent of my wealth, could have been completely transparent about all my holdings and assets. But I'd chosen not to because Margaret was divorcing me while I was helpless in a hospital bed, and I'd seen no reason to reward that cruelty with honesty about money she'd never earned and had never known about. She'd decided I wasn't worth staying married to because my stroke had made me damaged and inconvenient, had chosen to leave me at my most vulnerable moment, and I'd decided she didn't deserve to know about or benefit from wealth I'd built before I'd ever met her. The $12 million had sat untouched in those accounts for 7 years while I'd been in the rehabilitation facility, had continued to grow through compound interest and market appreciation, had been managed by financial advisors who'd known about my stroke, but had continued handling my investments according to the strategies we'd established years earlier. The money had generated income that had accumulated in the accounts, had funded my care at the facility through automatic payments from one of the accounts, had been more than enough to cover all my medical expenses and rehabilitation costs without me having to touch the principal. Margaret had no idea any of this existed, had no idea that the man she'd divorced as a financial burden had millions of dollars that could have paid for the best care and the best therapies, and made his recovery significantly easier if she'd bothered to stay and support him. My sons had no idea their father was a multimillionaire, had apparently assumed I was just a regular middle-class guy who'd worked as a trader and had a modest nest egg, had never questioned why they should visit or support their father because they'd thought there was nothing to gain from maintaining that relationship. They'd all written me off as someone who'd had a stroke and become disabled and therefore wasn't worth their time or attention, had decided that a paralyzed man with speech problems was an embarrassment they didn't want to deal with, had chosen to walk away without ever considering that I might have value beyond my physical abilities. The irony was devastating. They'd abandoned a multimillionaire because they'd thought he was a burden, had walked away from someone who could have made their lives significantly more comfortable if they'd just shown basic human decency and visited occasionally. 2 years into my abandonment at Riverside Care Facility, when I'd regained enough speech and cognitive function to make legal decisions and think clearly about my future, I'd called my longtime attorney, Richard Morrison, to come visit me at the facility. Richard had been my lawyer for over 20 years, had handled my business contracts and estate planning before the stroke, had known about my wealth because he'd helped me structure some of the trusts and holdings that kept my money separate from Margaret's knowledge, and he'd been one of the few people from my old life who'd actually visited me during my recovery. He'd come to see me every few months just to check on my progress, had brought me books and magazines, and had sat talking with me about the outside world when I'd been starving for conversation with someone who wasn't medical staff. Richard had known about Margaret divorcing me, had actually been the one to review the divorce papers before I'd signed them, had advised me that I didn't have to disclose the full extent of my wealth during the settlement because the lawyers hadn't asked the right questions, and I had no legal obligation to volunteer information they hadn't specifically requested. When I'd called him to come to the facility this time, I'd had a specific purpose in mind, had been thinking for months about what I wanted to do with my money when I eventually died, had been lying in that hospital bed watching nurses care for me while my family stayed away, and had realized exactly who deserved to benefit from the wealth I'd accumulated. Richard had arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, had come to my room with his briefcase and his legal pads, had sat down in the chair next to my bed and had asked what I needed. I'd told him I wanted to change my will completely, wanted to remove Margaret and David and Robert from any mention in the document, wanted to make sure that not $1 of my $12 million estate would go to the family that had abandoned me for 2 years and showed no signs of ever coming back. My speech had still been somewhat slurred at that point, but I'd been able to make myself understood, had been clear and firm about what I wanted even though my words hadn't come out perfectly, had told Richard exactly how I wanted my estate distributed when I died. Richard had listened carefully and had taken notes, had asked clarifying questions to make sure he understood my intentions, had not tried to talk me out of it or suggest I was being too harsh or remind me that blood is thicker than water. He'd seen what my family had done, had known about their complete absence during my recovery, had understood that 2 years of abandonment while I'd been helpless and fighting to survive wasn't something that deserved to be rewarded with inheritance, and he'd simply asked me where I wanted the money to go instead. I'd told him I wanted the bulk of my estate to go to Riverside Care Facility, wanted $4 million designated specifically for improving patient care and increasing staff salaries, wanted the nurses and therapists and social workers who'd actually been my family to benefit from money that would make their jobs easier and their lives more comfortable. These people had shown up for me every single day for 2 years, had celebrated my progress and had supported me through setbacks, had treated me with dignity and kindness when my blood family had treated me like I was already dead, and they deserved to be rewarded for that loyalty. I'd specified that $1 million should go directly to Nurse Maria Rodriguez, the woman who'd been assigned to me since my arrival and who'd become like a daughter to me over 2 years of daily care and genuine affection. Maria had a family of her own to support, had worked long hours for modest pay, had given me more love and attention than my actual children had given, and I wanted her to have financial security as thanks for making my recovery bearable and giving me a reason to keep fighting. I'd told Richard I wanted $2 million divided among the physical therapy staff who'd worked with me, the people who'd pushed me to walk again and had refused to let me give up when progress seemed impossible, who'd spent hundreds of hours helping me rebuild strength and mobility that the stroke had taken away. These therapists had worked with me 5 days a week for 2 years, had gotten to know me as a person rather than just a patient, had invested themselves in my recovery in ways that went beyond their job descriptions. I'd designated $5 million to go to stroke recovery research and programs supporting abandoned elderly patients, wanted my money to help fund studies that might prevent strokes or improve recovery outcomes, wanted to support organizations that helped people like me who'd been discarded by their families when they'd become inconvenient. If my wealth could help even one person avoid the abandonment I'd experienced or help researchers develop better treatments for stroke survivors, then it would be money well spent and would give meaning to my suffering. Richard had written all of this down carefully, had asked specific questions about how I wanted the charitable distribution structured, had made notes about organizations and causes I wanted to support, had ensured that my intentions were documented clearly so there could be no confusion about where my money should go. He'd then asked me directly if I was sure I wanted to completely exclude my wife and sons, had given me a chance to reconsider or to leave them even a small amount. But I'd been absolutely certain that they deserved nothing. I'd told Richard to make the will ironclad, to structure it in ways that would make it legally uncontestable, to include language that made it clear these distributions were intentional and based on sound judgment rather than confusion or diminished capacity from my stroke. Richard had assured me he'd make it bulletproof, would have it properly witnessed by people who could testify to my mental competence, would build in provisions that would make challenging the will both expensive and futile, would protect my wishes so that the people I actually cared about would benefit from my estate, After 7 years of intensive rehabilitation at Riverside Care Facility, I'd finally recovered enough function to leave the hospital and transition to independent living, had worked with therapists and doctors to reach a point where I could manage basic daily tasks on my own, without needing constant medical supervision or assistance with every aspect of my life. The progress had been slow and frustrating and had required more determination than I'd known I possessed, but eventually I'd regained enough mobility and speech and cognitive function that staying in a long-term care facility no longer made medical sense. At 75 years old, I could walk with a cane, could move around independently, even though my left side was still weaker than my right, and probably always would be. Could navigate stairs slowly and carefully, could get myself dressed and fed and through all the daily routines that most people took for granted. My speech had improved dramatically from the slurred, unintelligible sounds I'd made in the early months after the stroke. I could hold conversations and express myself clearly, even though I sometimes still struggled with finding the right words, or spoke slightly slower than I had before the stroke. The facility staff had helped me find an apartment that was close to Riverside, had made sure it was accessible with grab bars in the bathroom and a walk-in shower and other modifications that would make independent living safer for someone with my limitations. I'd been able to pay for the apartment and all the accessibility modifications easily from my investment accounts, had written checks that had barely made a dent in my $12 million portfolio, had finally been able to use some of my wealth to improve my own quality of life, rather than just letting it sit in accounts accumulating interest. Moving into that apartment had felt like a rebirth, had been the physical manifestation of my recovery, and my refusal to let the stroke destroy me completely. Had represented 7 years of work and pain and determination finally paying off in independence and dignity. I'd furnished the place simply but comfortably, had set up a home office where I could manage my investments and stay mentally engaged, had created a life for myself that felt normal and purposeful, even though I was living it alone without any family involvement. I'd continued visiting Riverside Care Facility weekly even after I'd moved out, had come back to see the staff who'd become my real family, had brought them coffee and treats, and had sat talking with nurses and therapists during their breaks. Maria and James and Patricia and all the others who'd supported me through 7 years of recovery had been genuinely happy to see me thriving, had taken pride in my independence because they'd worked so hard to help me achieve it, had welcomed my visits because I was one of the success stories that made their difficult jobs feel worthwhile. Living independently meant I could manage my financial portfolio actively again, could review my investments and make decisions about trading and asset allocation, could use my brain in ways the stroke had temporarily taken away but I'd fought to regain. The $12 million had grown over 7 years through market appreciation and compound interest. The accounts I'd built before the stroke had continued performing well under the management of my financial advisors, and I was actually wealthier now than I'd been before the stroke despite 7 years of medical expenses. My family had no idea about any of this, had no idea I'd left Riverside, had no idea I was living independently in an apartment just a few miles from the facility where they'd abandoned me. Had no idea I'd recovered function they'd probably assumed I'd never regain. Margaret and David and Robert had written me off 7 years ago when they'd visited for 20 minutes and had seen me paralyzed and speech impaired, had made assumptions about my future based on my worst moments, had decided I'd be stuck in that hospital bed forever, being a burden on the medical system and society. They'd never bothered to check on my progress, had never called the facility to ask how I was doing or whether I'd improved, had apparently been content to assume I was still exactly where they'd left me 7 years ago, still helpless and disabled and requiring total care. The fact that I'd fought my way back to independence through sheer determination and the support of people who weren't related to me by blood had never occurred to them because they'd never cared enough to wonder about my life after they'd walked away. I'd sometimes thought about what would happen if I ran into them somewhere, if Margaret saw me at a grocery store, or if David and Robert happened to be somewhere I was and recognized their father walking with a cane, but walking nonetheless. Would they be shocked? Ashamed? Would they try to talk to me, or would they pretend they hadn't seen me? Would they make excuses for 7 years of absence, or would they just ignore the awkwardness and act like nothing was wrong? I'd never found out because I'd been careful to avoid places where they might be, had moved to a different area of the city, had built my new life in spaces where our paths wouldn't cross. Living independently at 75 with a cane and some permanent limitations from the stroke was a victory my family would never witness or celebrate, was a triumph I'd achieved despite their abandonment rather than with their support, was proof that the man they'd discarded as damaged and worthless had more strength and determination than they'd given him credit for. I'd built a quiet, peaceful life for myself, had my weekly visits with the Riverside staff, had my investment portfolio to manage, had my independence and dignity intact, even though my body would never be quite what it was before the stroke. After I'd settled into my new apartment and had gotten comfortable with my independent living routine, after I'd proven to myself that I could function on my own despite the limitations the stroke had left me with, I'd called Richard Morrison and had told him it was time to let my family know exactly what their 7 years of abandonment had cost them. I'd been thinking about this moment for years, had been planning what I wanted to say to them, had decided that they deserved to know while I was still alive that the burden they'd discarded had turned out to be worth $12 million they'd never see. Richard had agreed immediately, had said he'd been waiting for me to give him the go-ahead to contact them, had actually suggested doing this a year earlier, but I'd wanted to wait until I was fully settled in my independent life so they couldn't claim I was still disabled or incompetent. I'd wanted to make sure my recovery was complete enough that nobody could question my mental capacity or suggest that informing them about my wealth was some kind of confused mistake made by a brain-damaged stroke victim who didn't know what he was doing. I'd told Richard exactly what I wanted the letter to say, had outlined the key points that needed to be included, had specified that I wanted it sent by certified mail so there would be proof they'd received it and couldn't claim later that they'd never been informed. The letter needed to accomplish several things. It needed to inform them I'd recovered and was living independently, which they clearly didn't know. It needed to reveal the existence of my $12 million estate, which they'd had no idea about, and it needed to make absolutely clear that they'd been removed from my will completely and would inherit nothing. Richard had drafted the letter professionally but with an edge that captured exactly what I'd wanted to communicate, had started by informing them that Harold Patterson had made a full recovery from his stroke and was now living independently in his own apartment managing his own affairs. This alone would be shocking to them since they'd probably assumed, if they'd thought about me at all, that I was still in Riverside being cared for by staff, still partially paralyzed and speech impaired, still the damaged version of me they'd seen 7 years ago and had decided wasn't worth visiting. The letter had then stated that I'd updated my will and estate plan, had made this sound routine and businesslike rather than emotional or vindictive, had explained that as my former wife and sons they were being notified of changes that affected them. Richard had written that I had an estate valued at approximately $12 million, had included that number in both numerals and spelled out so there could be no confusion about the amount, had made sure they'd understand the magnitude of what they'd never known existed. Then came the part I'd been most looking forward to, the section where Richard informed them that they'd been removed entirely from my estate plan, that not $1 of the $12 million would be going to Margaret or David or Robert, that everything would be distributed to Riverside Care Facility staff and charitable organizations supporting stroke recovery and abandoned elderly patients. The letter had stated this clearly and firmly, had left no room for misunderstanding or hope that maybe they'd get something small, had made it explicit that their complete absence from my life for 7 years had resulted in their complete removal from any financial benefit. Richard had included a particularly effective paragraph that I'd specifically requested, language stating that I wanted them to know now, while I was still alive, exactly what their abandonment had cost them. That I didn't want them finding out after my death and being able to avoid confronting what they'd done. The letter had said that 7 years of not visiting, not calling, not checking on my recovery, not showing any interest in whether I lived or died had consequences, and those consequences were that people who actually cared about me would benefit from my wealth while they would receive nothing. The letter had ended by stating that I didn't want contact from any of them, that this notification was purely informational and not an invitation to reconciliation, that my decision was final and not subject to discussion or negotiation. Richard had included his contact information and had stated that any attempts to reach me directly would be considered harassment, that all communication should go through his office, that he was instructed to refuse any requests for meetings or phone calls on my behalf. Richard had sent 3 identical letters by certified mail, one to Margaret at her current address, one to David, and one to Robert, had made sure each of them received their own copy so none of them could claim they hadn't been personally informed. The letters had been sent on a Monday morning, would have been delivered by Wednesday at the latest, and then all we could do was wait to see how they'd react to learning that the man they'd abandoned had recovered and was wealthy beyond anything they'd imagined. I'd felt enormous satisfaction when Richard had shown me the final version of the letter before mailing it, had read through it multiple times, enjoying every word, had particularly loved the cold professional tone that made their abandonment seem like a business decision that had simply resulted in natural business consequences. There was no anger or bitterness in the language, just straightforward information about my recovery and my wealth, and their complete exclusion from benefiting from either one. Margaret had called Richard's office within an hour of receiving the certified letter. Richard had told me later that he'd actually been sitting at his desk when his secretary had buzzed to say my ex-wife was on the line demanding to speak with him immediately. He'd taken the call and had recorded it as I'd requested, had wanted me to hear exactly how she'd reacted to learning about the wealth she'd never known existed, and he'd sent me the audio file that same evening so I could listen to her voice for the first time in 7 years. Her first words had been $12 million. "That's impossible," said with a tone of absolute shock and disbelief, like she couldn't process that the number she'd just read was real and applied to the man she'd divorced while he was helpless in a hospital bed. She told Richard that Harold had never had that kind of money, that she'd been married to me for 32 years and would have known if I was secretly a multimillionaire, that there must be some mistake or confusion or misunderstanding about the amount. Richard had responded calmly that there was no mistake, that I'd made my fortune in commodities trading in the 1980s and 1990s, that I'd built wealth over decades through smart investing and aggressive trading strategies that had paid off consistently. He'd explained that I'd kept my business finances completely separate from my personal finances, that the accounts she'd known about during our marriage represented only a small fraction of my actual wealth, that the $12 million had been sitting in various accounts and trusts and holdings the entire time we'd been married. Margaret had sputtered trying to understand this, had asked how that was possible, how I could have hidden that much money from her, why she hadn't known about it during the divorce. Richard had explained patiently that I hadn't hidden anything. I'd simply maintained separate business accounts that she'd never asked about, that during the divorce her lawyers had requested disclosure of joint assets, and I'd provided exactly what they'd asked for, that nobody had done the deep investigation that would have revealed the full extent of my wealth because they'd never thought to look. She'd gone quiet for a moment processing this information, and then her tone had changed, had shifted from shocked to calculating as she'd started to understand the implications. She'd asked Richard if the divorce settlement could be reopened given this new information, if she had legal grounds to claim she'd been defrauded or deceived during the divorce, if there was any way to get access to money that should have been divided during the settlement. Richard had shut that down immediately, had told her the divorce was finalized 7 years ago, that the statute of limitations for challenging it had long since passed, that she'd received everything she was entitled to under the settlement agreement she'd signed. Margaret had then tried a different approach, had started talking about how she'd made a mistake leaving me at the hospital, how she'd been scared and overwhelmed by my stroke and hadn't been thinking clearly, how seeing that I'd recovered made her realize she'd acted rashly. She'd said that maybe we could talk about reconciliation, that 7 years was a long time and people could change, that she missed me and regretted the divorce and wanted a chance to rebuild what we'd had. Richard had listened to this without responding and then had asked her directly why she was calling now after 7 years of complete silence, why she'd suddenly discovered these feelings of regret within an hour of learning about my $12 million estate. Margaret had stumbled over her answer, had tried to claim the timing was coincidental, that she'd been thinking about reaching out for months but hadn't known how, that learning about my recovery from the letter had given her the courage to make contact. The transparency of her motivation had been stunning, even though I'd expected exactly this response. She wasn't calling because she actually missed me or regretted abandoning me. She was calling because she'd realized the burden she'd walked away from was actually a multimillionaire, and she wanted access to that wealth. Richard had told her firmly that I didn't want reconciliation, that I'd been very clear about not wanting contact from her or my sons, that the letter was purely informational and not an invitation to resume any kind of relationship. My sons David and Robert had responded differently. Instead of calling, they'd shown up at Richard's office 2 days after receiving their letters, had apparently coordinated their visit, and had arrived together demanding to see me. Richard's secretary had turned them away, but they'd insisted on speaking with Richard himself, had waited in the lobby for 3 hours until he'd agreed to meet with them briefly, just to hear what they had to say. David had apparently been the spokesperson, had told Richard that there'd been a misunderstanding, that they'd wanted to visit me over the years, but hadn't known how to reconnect after so much time had passed, that they'd been told by someone that I didn't want visitors, and they'd respected those wishes. Robert had nodded along with this story, had added that they'd called the facility multiple times over the years to check on my progress, but had been told I was fine and didn't need anything from them. Richard had pulled out the visitor logs from Riverside that he'd requested years ago when I'd first changed my will, had shown my sons the records proving that not one phone call from either of them had been logged in 7 years, that their names had never appeared on any visitor list, that their claim about calling the facility was demonstrably false. He'd also pointed out that even if someone had told them I didn't want visitors, which nobody had, a father suffering from a catastrophic stroke probably needed his sons to push past that and show up anyway, rather than using it as an excuse to stay away for 7 years. David and Robert had both looked uncomfortable being confronted with proof of their lies, had shifted to a different approach, and had said they wanted to see me now, wanted a chance to rebuild their relationship with their father, wanted to apologize in person for the time they'd lost. Richard had told them what I'd instructed him to say, which was that I didn't want contact with either of them, that the time for apologies and relationship building had been 7 years ago when I was lying in a hospital bed unable to speak properly, that their sudden interest in reconciliation within days of learning about my wealth was noted and rejected. Over the following months after Richard had sent those letters, my family had tried everything they could think of to make contact with me, had launched a campaign of attempted reconciliation that was so transparently motivated by greed that it would have been laughable if it hadn't been so insulting. Margaret had sent multiple letters to Richard's office, asking him to forward them to me, thick envelopes that Richard had shown me unopened, asking if I wanted to read what she'd written, and I'd told him to return every single one with a note saying I didn't want contact and she should stop trying. I'd eventually gotten curious enough to let Richard open one of her letters and read it to me, had wanted to hear what excuse she was using to justify 7 years of abandonment now that she knew about my money. The letter had been 6 pages of handwritten rambling about how she'd been advised by doctors not to visit me during my recovery, how medical professionals had told her that seeing family members might stress me and slow my progress, how she'd stayed away because she'd thought that was what was best for my health, even though it had broken her heart. The lies had been so obvious and so poorly constructed that they'd almost been offensive. No doctor would ever tell a spouse not to visit their husband recovering from a stroke. Family support was considered essential for recovery, and every medical professional at Riverside had asked me constantly where my family was. Margaret had apparently thought I was brain damaged enough to believe this story, had assumed 7 years in a hospital had made me stupid or gullible, had underestimated my ability to see through manipulation that wasn't even clever. She'd also written that she'd always loved me, that divorcing me had been the biggest mistake of her life, that she'd spent 7 years regretting her decision and wishing she could take it back. She'd claimed that she'd wanted to reach out so many times but had been too ashamed of abandoning me, had been afraid I wouldn't forgive her, had convinced herself I was better off without her presence in my life. The letter had ended with a plea for a chance to talk, just one conversation to explain herself properly, an opportunity to apologize in person and maybe begin the process of reconciliation. Richard had asked if I wanted to respond, and I'd told him absolutely not, that Margaret had 7 years to feel ashamed and reach out, and she'd done neither until she'd learned about $12 million, that her timing made her motivations crystal clear regardless of what she wrote in letters. I'd instructed Richard to return all future correspondence from her unopened, to refuse to read or forward anything she sent, to make it clear through his actions that I had no interest in anything she had to say. My sons had tried showing up at places they thought I might be, had apparently hired someone to investigate where I was living because they'd started appearing at locations near my apartment. I'd seen David once at a coffee shop I frequented, had watched him look around, obviously searching for someone, and I'd left through the back entrance before he could spot me. Another time, Robert had been standing outside the grocery store I usually shopped at, had been there for over an hour, according to the staff I'd asked, clearly waiting to ambush me. I'd hired a private investigator to document their stalking behavior, had built a file of evidence showing them following me and trying to make contact against my explicit wishes, had prepared to get a restraining order if they didn't stop. Richard had sent them both cease and desist letters, warning that their behavior constituted harassment, that I had no interest in seeing or speaking with them, that if they didn't stop attempting contact, I would pursue legal action against them. They'd hired their own private investigator trying to find out more about my life and my finances, someone who'd shown up at Riverside asking questions about me and had been turned away by staff who were protective of my privacy. The investigator had tried to get information from my financial advisors and accountants, had attempted to trace my assets and understand the full extent of my wealth, had clearly been hired to build a case for challenging my will or finding some legal angle to claim they deserved a portion of my estate. Margaret had sent flowers to my apartment after somehow finding my address, elaborate expensive arrangements with cards that said she was thinking of me and hoping we could talk. I'd donated the flowers to a nursing home and had told Richard to warn her that any further unwanted gifts would be documented as harassment. She'd tried calling Richard's office weekly, asking if I'd changed my mind about contact, asking if he'd spoken to me about her letters, begging him to convince me to give her just 5 minutes of my time. David and Robert had both written their own letters that Richard had shown me, each claiming they'd been lied to about my condition and my wishes regarding visitors, each insisting they'd wanted to maintain a relationship but had been prevented by circumstances beyond their control. David had claimed his mother had told him I didn't want to see them, and he'd believed her, had said he'd been trying to respect my wishes by staying away. Robert had said he'd called the facility multiple times and had been told I was unavailable for visitors, had convinced himself this meant I needed space and time alone. All of their excuses had fallen apart under basic scrutiny. The visitor logs proved nobody had called asking about me. The staff had testified they'd never turned anyone away or told family members not to visit. Every claim they made about trying to maintain contact was contradicted by 7 years of documented evidence showing complete absence. They'd all been caught in obvious lies, and rather than admitting the truth, which was that they'd abandoned me because my stroke made me inconvenient, they'd doubled down on increasingly implausible stories about misunderstandings and miscommunication. I'd rejected every single attempt at reconciliation, had maintained absolute no contact despite their escalating efforts to reach me, had made it clear through Richard that 7 years of abandonment couldn't be undone by a few months of trying now that money was involved. The people who'd shown up were my real family, the nurses and therapists at Riverside who'd cared for me when I was helpless, and the people who'd stayed away had forfeited any right to call themselves family, regardless of biological connection. I'm 75 years old now, living peacefully in my apartment, managing my $12 million estate that continues to grow through smart investments and compound interest, visiting my real family at Riverside Care Facility every week, where the staff treats me like I'm someone worth caring about, rather than a burden to be discarded. My life has settled into a comfortable routine that includes managing my portfolio, staying physically active within my limitations, reading extensively, and spending time with the people who actually showed up when I was at my lowest point and needed support the most. The $12 million sits in various accounts and investments generating income that I don't even need. The money grows faster than I could possibly spend it even if I wanted to live extravagantly, which I don't. And every month that passes means the estate my family will never inherit becomes larger and more valuable. I've updated my will twice since sending those letters to make sure the distributions are exactly what I want, have added specific bequests to individual nurses and therapists who went above and beyond, have designated money for scholarships and programs that will help people long after I'm gone. My ex-wife Margaret and my sons David and Robert know I'm alive. Know I've recovered enough to live independently, know exactly how much money exists that they'll never see, and that knowledge apparently tortures them based on the continued attempts at contact that Richard fields monthly. Margaret still calls Richard's office regularly, asking if I've changed my mind about speaking with her. Still sends letters that get returned unopened, still apparently believes that persistence will eventually wear me down and I'll agree to reconciliation that would give her access to wealth she never earned. David and Robert have apparently given up on direct contact after the cease and desist letters, But Richard tells me they've been trying to find legal angles to challenge my will or claim they're entitled to something despite being explicitly excluded. They've consulted with multiple attorneys who've all told them the same thing, that my will is ironclad and legally uncontestable, that I have every right to distribute my estate however I choose, that being someone's child doesn't automatically entitle you to inheritance, especially when you've abandoned that parent for 7 years. The irony that probably keeps them up at night is that if they'd just visited me occasionally over those 7 years, if they'd shown even minimal interest in my recovery and well-being, if they'd demonstrated basic human decency instead of complete abandonment, they probably would have remained in my will and would eventually inherit millions. Their greed and their decision that a disabled stroke victim wasn't worth their time has cost them more money than most people earn in their entire lives, has resulted in them losing access to generational wealth that could have changed their families' futures. I sometimes imagine their faces when my will is eventually read after I die, when Richard stands in his office and announces that the entire 12 million plus however much it's grown to by then is going to Riverside Care Facility and stroke recovery programs and the specific nurses and therapists who cared for me. I imagine Margaret realizing that divorcing me while I was helpless cost her millions. Imagine David and Robert understanding that 20 minutes was the only time they spent with their father in the last 7 years of his life, and it cost them an inheritance that would have made them wealthy. The staff at Riverside knows they're in my will. I've told them because I wanted them to know while I'm alive that their kindness and dedication will be rewarded, that the years they spent caring for me when nobody else won't be forgotten. Maria cried when I told her about the $1 million designated for her, had tried to refuse it saying she'd just been doing her job, but I'd insisted that her job had been caring for patients, and what she'd given me had gone far beyond professional duty into genuine love and family. I visit Riverside every Tuesday afternoon, walk through the halls with my cane saying hello to current patients and staff. Sit in the common area, talking with Maria and James and Patricia and the others who made 7 years of rehabilitation bearable. These visits are the highlight of my week. These people are my real family in ways that Margaret and David and Robert never were even before the stroke. And knowing that my wealth will eventually benefit them brings me more satisfaction than spending it on myself ever could. My biological family abandoned me when I had a stroke and became inconvenient, walked away from a man who'd been a husband and father for decades because disability made me embarrassing and caregiving seemed too difficult. They never came back, not for birthdays or holidays or any of the 2,555 days I spent fighting to recover, never checked if I was alive or dead, or improving or declining, just erased me from their lives completely while I was helpless to fight back. Now I've recovered, and I'm living independently, and I have $12 million they didn't know existed, and they're begging for reconciliation now that the burden has turned out to be a multimillionaire who can walk and talk and manage his own affairs. But 7 years of absence can't be erased by a few months of greed-motivated contact. 7 years of abandonment can't be forgiven because they suddenly realized what they walked away from. 7 years of not caring whether I lived or died means they don't get to benefit from the life I built after they left. I was left alone in a hospital by my family for 7 years after my stroke. They visited once for 20 minutes and never came back. My wife divorced me while I was helpless, and my sons let her erase me from their lives without protest. When I recovered and had my lawyer notify them about my $12 million secret estate that they'd never inherit, they panicked and started begging for reconciliation. Now they know the man they abandoned as a burden was actually a multimillionaire. Now they understand that their cruelty cost them millions they'll never see. Now they spend their days knowing that nurses and therapists will inherit wealth that could have been theirs if they'd just shown basic human decency. The will is written, the will is waiting, and when I eventually die, every dollar of my fortune goes to people who actually showed up when I needed them. My family taught me an important lesson about who deserves my money. The people who are there when you have nothing are the ones who should benefit when you have everything. They failed that test completely. They'll never see a penny.